noticed yesterday, for me, there were some teachings, and so I woke up this morning going, I'm not really feeling fully complete, so I had to go back and check in. I checked in with Jordan and Jessica, because often as teachers, something happens in the room that you don't understand, or you misinterpret, or, and what I've learned to do as a way of surviving inside my own skin is to reflect and then come back, because you don't always get it the first time. And sometimes in the crying out, I think especially those of us who work with kids, it may come out in a way that the articulation isn't something that you can fully hear. But Larry really evoked something yesterday with the story of the underground. And it just kind of bubbled up into the room. And then Rox and Jessica and David and Jordan, and so there was like all of these things stacked on top of each other, and I was looking at that going, that's a complexity that I don't exactly know how to hold, so I'm going to avoid that for this moment. But it always catches me about 3 a.m. Whatever I try to suppress or avoid, it shows up, and I go, oh crap, all right, I have to deal with this. But there's a moment of holding in the group, of holding newness, and part of inviting the stranger in is the stranger is going to bring something strange or new. And that newness is really the opportunity. It's the seed of an opening for a community. So I could see spending a lot of time unpacking this narrative of the underground. And I think that could be the subject of an entire Chautauqua. We're moving into the completion today, and I think that's going to be part of the completion story. And I'm going to trust that that will be held in the completion story, but I wanted to acknowledge the cry. And Walter Brueggemann was, who, if you ever want to actually get the Old Testament, read Walter Brueggemann. I never thought the Old Testament had anything to do with me. And one time when I was going to Cincinnati, Peter said, we're going to have lunch with Walter Brueggemann. And I had no idea who he was. And he says he's an Old Testament scholar, so I thought, well, I better read one of his books. I know. We didn't talk anything about the book. I think it was much more mundane, like tuna fish sandwiches or whatever it was we were having for lunch. But in that, in the Exodus story, and I think it's a perennial story, and Rabbi Paula touched on an aspect of that story. That if we understand that when we're laboring in the land of Pharaoh, which he qualifies as the place of incessant productivity, right? Because the way the Jews became slaves was in the time of famine. They had to sell first their animals, then their land, then themselves to Pharaoh in order to eat. And when they finally reached the point where they had to leave, they had to go into the wilderness, which was the place with no support. And all there was manna, which was sufficient unto the day, but you couldn't pile it all up. You know, it was only sufficient to the day. We just had each other. So when we leave the endless productivity of the land of Pharaoh, there we are in the wilderness. And in some ways, Chautauqua is a way to come together in that wilderness for support and inspiration. And it's sufficient unto the day. The manna is sufficient unto the day. One of the issues was that when they finally got to the promised land, they recreated empire under Solomon. And so the form survived, even though the personalities changed. And the question is, how do we create the new forms? And one of the forms of education is the teacher as the knower and the student as the learner. And in a sense, that recreates the hierarchy of Pharaoh, the higher authority to whom we must all surrender. And what it does is it absents the creativity of the community from the process. And how do we bring that back? So connecting with the story this morning of the community rising, Shakti rising. Shakti to me is a term that is both feminine and universal. Because Shakti means energy. So the energy rising through the community to reinvigorate and reinstill the authorship of our own lives, is a powerful thing when we suddenly take responsibility for what happens. And I think taking responsibility for your response to what happens. And sometimes you have to say, I don't know. I don't know what to do. And that was the story that Rabbi Paula was telling. And sometimes we have to listen to the stranger. And the stranger may come from a totally different everything, And I also think within our communities, we can be strangers. And we can be isolated and marginalized within our own communities. And so the stranger may be everywhere, and it may be what we haven't discovered about each other. I had an experience this the other day with the yoga teacher training group. So I went in and I put them into small groups with a question, And at the end they said, we've been together for 3 weeks, but the question and the being together allowed us to discover ourselves in a way that we hadn't seen each other before. And so there's so much more than we see. And so I want to just kind of appreciate the sensitivity that was in the room that I couldn't see and having it brought forward. And then for me, the only act is to come back and be curious and say, what was that about? And then when you actually can understand it, you can bring language to it. And I'm not going to attempt to do that because I think everybody's got their own story, but I wanted to acknowledge partly the accidental, perhaps beautiful, evoking and naming of the underground. And now we're in the sorting process of deciding how that connects with the overground and what it means and what do we do about it and all of that. And that's the work I think that we have to do. And it's part of the naming. And so I just want to say, I had no idea what to do with that, but I reflected, and I still don't know what to do about it other than to name it and then see what we do about it. Because I think that's also part of the lesson is what are we going to do? So with that, I'd like to move over to a new story